Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Ari Lowry, and today I'll be presenting on the impacts of the American election cycle on legislative action in the period 1970 to 2020. First, I want to talk a little bit about why I chose to pursue this type of research. In the last year, we have seen a multitude of examples of the election cycle not going according to plan for candidates, and this diverts media attention and important political resources away from legislative action. Combining this with the complicated sets of checks and balances that we have in the United States to account for legislation, I was really curious on how impacts like this could actually have numerical impacts on the bills passed and the productivity of democracy in the United States. This was especially important when I found out that the average presidential campaign cycle is 384 days. When thinking about other countries and international election models, most limit campaign cycles to 90 days or less. So this figure was incredibly startling to me and made me want to pursue this research even more. There were three foundational sources that helped me to develop my research question and figure out what I wanted to inquire about. The first one was from Melissa Gottlieb, a professor at Texas Tech University, who in 2015 authored The Election Cycle and Voter Impacts. This paper gave me an incredible amount of insight on how more psychological and sociological impacts can happen due to the election cycle. One of the main impacts that Melissa Gottlieb found was that participants in the election who were more involved, people who voted, maybe helped their candidate's campaign, were more marginally impacted by the election cycle and by rates of legislative action. My second foundational source was authored by Russell Clayton in 2014, and this is a high-level discussion on election formulation and strategies. This was amazing because it gave me an inside look on how the elected officials view the election process and what they find important in terms of marketing and in terms of using their manpower to achieve re-elections and elections. This allowed me to further understand why diversions may occur and how elected officials segment their power, authority, and time to be able to make time for legislative duties and campaign duties. My final source that was very foundational in my research was authored by Kirsten Ralph in 1980. Though this is an older source, it was an amazing analysis of domestic and international election models, and it helped me to realize just how interesting of a microcosm the United States really is, especially because most countries have some sort of campaign limits for higher office, while no such thing is had in the United States. This helped me, made me realize that I wanted to divert all of my attention to these domestic elections. All of this led to my research question, which is to what extent, if at all, is the executive actions passed in the United States affected by the election cycle? I'd like to start off with a couple of assumptions that are very important to my research. The first assumption is that citizens want their legislators to pass bills. Essentially, citizens want things to be getting done, and citizens want their democracy to feel productive. They want bills passed that will positively impact their lives. The second assumption is that a relationship exists between the factors analyzed, and it is fully defined by all the factors, meaning legislative action is only represented by the factors I analyzed in my study, and there are no external variables present outside of the ones that I controlled in my confounding variables. This is incredibly important because it helps me ensure my conclusions are valid. I would also like to define legislative action. So I define this in three main terms: the bills voted on by the legislative branch, the bills enacted by the legislative branch, and executive orders signed by the executive branch. This is something that's not always included in discussions about legislative action, but I thought it was important because going back to the checks and balances that exist within the legislative election cycle, I thought it was important to look at multiple branches and how they interconnect with each other to compensate around the election cycle. So, with that being said, I have some executive and legislative distinctions. As far as executive distinctions, I'm talking about presidential elections when I discuss executive elections. This means they go from year 1, the year a new president takes office, to year 4, the year an election takes place. On the legislative branch, I use the legislative elections in the House and Senate, meaning they have a year 1 and a year 2, year 1 is the new start of a Congress, and year 2 is the end of that Congress. So I go based on the cycle of Congresses. It's also important to note that I'll talk about the legislative branch and legislative action. Legislative action, as I discussed, was the different types of bills voted on and enacted, while the legislative branch is the actual physical House and Senate. This all aims to address the research gap that is a theoretical gap in standardized metrics for legislative action and government elections as an interconnected process, as well as a knowledge gap on how this may affect the numbers of bills represented and enacted in the American democracy. In order to further understand this, I used a mixed method study composed of 2 main components. My first component was a data analysis and a deductive data analysis using the program R. I chose to use this program because it allowed me to analyze a lot of data with some constants. So I was analyzing all my data in the exact same way, and it would better account for the bias of only having one coder to connect these dots. Part 2 was an interview with an elected official in the New York State Senate, which helped me to further understand the phenomena I saw in my results and helped me to add more qualitative and quantitative data to have more balanced study. By the numbers, I analyzed a total of 9 data sets, and they were 78% direct data, meaning they came directly from the federal government. I analyzed a total of 43 years within my selected time span, and 14% of years were excluded due to confounds. These confounds included terrorist attacks, wars, and political polarization. This is a total list of my variables analyzed, and while it looks extremely complicated, I mainly want to focus on bills enacted, bills voted on, and executive orders, as these are where I found correlations, and these are also where I had enough data. For example, with constitutional amendments, they may have some impact, but there's such a low rate of occurrence, especially when controlling for only 1970 to 2020, that no real conclusions could be drawn. I chose this method, and I felt that it was well aligned because it would allow for the most possible statistical validity. And as this is foundational research, I thought this was extremely important, especially considering the lack of standardized metrics within my field. It also maximized my output of quantitative and qualitative data and was ideal for my longitudinal type inquiry. I hypothesized that through year 1, year 2, and year 3, the rates of legislative action would slowly increase, with a decrease at year 4 as materials and attention was diverted to the election cycle across the executive election cycle, and we would see a microcosm of this within the legislative cycle. First, in my research process, I defined and extracted my data. I then cleaned it for unwanted variables and outliers and coded my data. And then I correlated my data analysis with my interview anecdotes, and I did this for both legislative and executive data. So within my coding process, I cleaned my data twice to extract outliers, once within groupings and once overall. I also analyzed my outlier occurrence rate and reliability and found that my outlier occurrence rate was 98% accurate, meaning it was very unlikely that I had any additional outliers, and I found no outliers that I could not find outside justification for. I counter-correlated my years with each other between both the legislative and executive years. Then I cleaned my data again within the groupings, and I developed a rational relationship between the variables in the form of a formulaic analysis. My results. I started with a numerical analysis, and I'd like to focus on these legislative and executive correlations. As we can see, within the legislative years, the mean and median amount of bills grow steadily between years 1 and years 2. When we look at executive correlations, from years 1 to year 2, we have an increase in both the mean and the median, followed by a decrease to year 3, and the biggest increase of all occurs in year 4. When we look at executive orders, we see that they peak in year 1, and then decrease slightly again in year 3, although this correlation is not statistically significant, and they increase slightly in year 4 across the executive election cycle, while they only show decreases across the legislative cycle. These are some additional graphs that I find are helpful, and I'd also like to note that the standard deviation remains consistent relative to the number of years analyzed and the size of the formulas. I also want to focus on this chart as it can show how the standard deviations are impacted by the numerical values. This these graphs are the best ones that I could find that depict the combined impact of the election cycle on legislative action, meaning that they account for both parties. As we can see here, we have a linear relationship between some variables, while other variables, these are the variables I chose not to study, had a more indirect relationship. As we can also see over here, we have our consistent number of executive orders with decrease, as well as our increase in bills. This was explained in my interviews, as my interviewee said that it may be compensation from the executive branch to compensate for underrepresentation of the legislative branch. This is a formula that I've developed that can predict the number of bills that will be enacted in a certain year by the legislative branch. Using Z, the number of the legislative year it is, being a year 1 or a year 2, X, the number of bills introduced in the previous year, and K, the year as a control for gradual bill increases over time, you can calculate an estimate with a 2.43% reliability for how many bills will be passed in the next year. I also like to focus on this graph as it can show you how the executive orders come at a decrease across the election cycle, and it provided an overall baseline for my legislative formulaic analysis, where when using X and Z, which are defined as the year in the legislative cycle and defined as the number of bills in the previous year that were introduced, you can find an estimate for the amount of bills that will be passed in the next year. So what do all these numbers mean? This is incredibly important to put in context of what it means for the American people, especially as 41% of Americans believe that the government is not doing enough or not moving fast enough to enact new legislation. And 59% of Americans believe that their lives are directly impacted by federal legislation. These differences across the legislative cycle and executive cycle could have massive impacts on how Americans view the democracy and the productivity or unproductivity of their government. It could also directly impact things like public policy or bills that need to be passed exigently, as the form of the legislative cycle and the elections, when they are introduced, could play a massive role on how fast or whether or not they're passed. This brings me to the implications of my study. The first is the predictability of legislative action. My formulaic analysis is able to predict legislative action in a way that has not yet been found. It also provides a direct relationship between the election cycle year and the bills enacted, and the relationship between executive orders and House and Senate action as a relationship. And it also has demonstrated external validity. Although there's no correlational validity that I could find, it generally was congruent with my base studies, though I couldn't find any that ran parallel to my study. That being said, my study is not without its limitations. One of my main limitations was my data availability. Although I was able to use a lot of direct data, a lot of it came from different federal registrars, meaning there could be different definitions or there could be data that is not included. Another is the number of variables analyzed, as I focused on a few key variables, but I would love to see further research focusing on more, especially considering social constructs and additional things such as different executive movements and political polarization, as I controlled for that but didn't study it directly. I also have a lack of studies for comparison, meaning I have no existing standard of analysis and I couldn't get any correlational validity within my study. My recommendations for further research mainly center around different ways of conducting this research. I was only able to conduct one interview with a local New York State official, not a federal official. I think it could be incredibly valuable to get more inside information regarding how these officials view the election cycle and how they try to balance the election cycle with their duties. I think this could give more insight to the phenomena that we have seen in this study, and it could also provide a basis for further research that could produce more reliable standards of analysis and more external validity for this type of research. This is my list of references. Thank you so much for your time, and I will now take my oral defense questions.
Okay, thank you so much for that. I am ready to go through those questions one by one, and first we will start with a
So if we go back to my foundational sources, I would say Melissa Gottlieb's source that regarded voter impact. It was an interview methodology as well as a send-out survey methodology, and that gave me a lot of foundational information about how these things can be really important and how legislative action can have a direct impact. And so that really helped me to create a foundation for my research. That also inspired me to pursue a partially interview-based method because I found that even though it was only interviews and surveys, Melissa Gottlieb was able to very accurately display both quantitative and qualitative data through that method, which was really important to me when I considered how I wanted to approach this. And also that basis for data that was kind of able to give me a signal that I was headed in the right direction was one of the only reasons that I felt confident enough to pursue a formulaic analysis.
Okay, thank you. And my next question has to do with the way in which you understand what you've shown us. And if I can make a question slightly more specific, if it is difficult for you to articulate, let me know. But who would use that formula that you created and when?
So I think that that formula could be of great use when thinking about bill introduction, because many of my studies talked about how important the time of introduction is, as in certain times of introducing bills, especially certain times of the year. So many of my studies focused on certain times of the year, like you should not introduce a bill in April because there's too much going on, the bill's not going to get seen, it's not going to get floor time, and it's less likely to be passed. And so that formula could be used on more of a year-to-year scale because there's lots of data on when you should introduce bills on a month-to-month scale, but that could talk more about things that are more enduring, that you want to pass at some point, but it's not within months, it's within years. And that formula could help you because if you know, well, in this year, it's going to be more likely that more bills are passed, you're thinking this is a great time to introduce bills, or maybe it's something that's going to require a lot of discussion, so you think, oh, well, I need to introduce this when less bills are being introduced and passed because that will give it more floor time and more ability for discussion, and it'll give these bills a better chance of being passed. So I think that's where it could be really vital, as well as just further research and having some sort of standard for how these relationships are linearly or non-linearly affecting each other.
Okay, and then lastly, how you reflect on your process. Think about the initial curiosity that led to your inquiry. What other areas of inquiry might that exact same curiosity lead to? You mentioned something about studying constructs, I think you said. Can you just expand on that a little bit?
So a lot of what I think that curiosity could lead to, I obviously took a very mathematical, data-centered approach because I really wanted the numbers, but it could lead to a lot of issues in social sciences. A lot of things about how is advertising affecting people? How is the balance of power affecting people? How are legislative officials affected by having to manage running for re-election while simultaneously having bills they need to introduce, things they need to vote on, things that are really important for them and for their jobs. So I think it could lead to a lot of those more social things. I think the main thing that that curiosity could also lead to, that I tried to incorporate through the interviews, is that whole idea of why is this happening and why are these legislative officials acting this way? Why is this the general House and Senate behavior? And how could this potentially kind of be altered? And how could these balances maybe be changed? And it also ties back to that idea of international election models. There were so many of my foundational studies that really had so much to do with comparing domestic election models to international election models. And I think that that can be a super valuable tool when it comes to seeing how can we make democracy more productive as a whole, and how can we implement systems that are going to allow bills that are important to citizens to be passed.
And at this point, do you think that you have a fairly solid understanding of the role of a politician, or just the tip of the iceberg, or somewhere in between?
I think it's really just the tip of the iceberg, and we need so much further research to further understand what's going on as far as their campaign strategies, their advertising strategies, their fiscal strategies, and how that is impacting legislative action and the democracy as a whole. Thank you.
Thank you very much.